My name is Riley Dawson. I'm 34 years old, living in a modest apartment just a short drive from the neighborhood where my childhood played out. For half a decade, almost every extra dollar I earned went straight into one thing: paying off my parents' $680,000 mortgage. I always imagined that once the final payment posted, there would be a moment. Maybe a quiet dinner. Maybe my dad putting a hand on my shoulder and telling me he was proud that I kept the house from slipping into foreclosure. Instead, what I got was a phone call. No greeting, no pause. "I know the mortgage is paid off," my dad said flatly. "All of it. We're giving the house to your brother as his graduation present." I remember staring at the blank wall in front of me, the phone warm against my ear, convinced I had misheard him. Before I could speak, he added, "And you're not invited to the party. I don't want your attitude ruining his big day." My throat felt tight. My brother had glided through life while I worked extra shifts just to keep the roof over their heads. Yet somehow I was the problem. I asked him if he was actually serious. He told me to stop obsessing over money, said families should be happy for each other. Then he hung up. I sat listening to the dead line for a long moment before turning to the only person who knew the truth behind those payments. "You want to tell them?" I asked, "or should I?" 3 days later, my brother's big celebration didn't unfold anything like the one they had imagined. But before I explain how everything collapsed that day, do me a quick favor. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this story. Your support helps others hear what happens when the responsible kid finally stops swallowing their pride. There was a time when news like this would have crushed me, and I still would have forced a smile and pretended I was fine. That habit didn't form overnight. I grew up in a 2-story house on a quiet Rochester street, a place no one else found remarkable, but to me it framed every memory. Every birthday candle, every slammed door, every late-night conversation lived in those walls. My father, Gregory Dawson, built his identity around keeping that roof standing. He ran a small auto repair shop near the edge of town and liked to think of himself as the guy who kept families going. But at home, his focus flowed one way. My younger brother Dylan was the future he talked about, even when all that future looked like was a struggling house and a business that limped through each month. My mother Angela drifted between the three of us, cooking, stretching thin budgets, soothing tension when voices got sharp. She assumed I would figure things out alone. And she assumed the world would always bend for Dylan. By the time I hit my teens, I learned not to ask. If there was money for a school trip, Dylan got it. If someone needed new clothes, he got them first. They treated me like someone who didn't need anything, so I adapted. I studied hard, worked whatever jobs I could, and built my independence brick by brick. When I left home for college, then for work that pattern crystallized, I took any position that paid enough to let me keep my head above water. I rented small apartments, drove cars with more rust than shine, cooked my meals, and convinced myself that freedom mattered more than help my parents never offered. Back in Rochester, my father's shop started sinking, business slowed. One bad equipment repair erased a month of income. A brutal winter made people postpone everything except emergencies. Payments on the house slipped behind. Late fees stacked up. My parents never told me directly, but stress clung to every phone call. One visit home, I opened the wrong drawer and found a thick pile of sealed envelopes, each stamped with the bank's logo. None opened. Holding those letters, I realized how close they were to losing the only stable part of our lives. And I had 2 choices: close the drawer and walk away, or step in. I went to my old bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed and started calculating. I knew what I made. I knew what I could sacrifice. If I funneled a huge chunk of every check into that loan, my own life would freeze. Promotions and raises would vanish into a house I didn't live in. Vacations, upgrades, simple pleasures, gone. I chose it anyway. The payments began quietly. Month after month, money left my account and shaved down a balance that didn't even list my name up front. My father talked loudly about keeping the home through grit and perseverance. My mom thanked me in private ways, a warm meal when I visited, a text saying she appreciated me, but she never challenged him to admit the truth. When things became truly unstable, a relative stepped in. My uncle, Edward Lane, helped my parents sign documents that protected the house, contingent on the payments continuing. My name was in those papers, tied to obligations I was already fulfilling and rights I hadn't considered. For years, I convinced myself that seeing the balance shrink was enough. I believed that once the debt disappeared, maybe my father would finally treat me with something that looked like respect. The seasons spun past my apartment window, Snow, slush, leaves burning into color. With each change, another statement went into the box under my bed, proof of a life I was funding but didn't belong to. Weekend visits always felt the same on the outside, peeling paint, creaking steps, but inside the distance grew. My father talked endlessly about the sacrifices he made to protect the house. I remained the silent line item he never said out loud. When Dylan entered his final year of college, everything shifted toward him. Phone calls circled around his classes, his plans. My mother asked me to attend his graduation for a family photo. My father called it a fresh start for everyone. By then the mortgage was nearly gone. I counted the remaining payments and pictured what I thought would happen, a quiet moment, a shared understanding. I didn't expect praise, just honesty. What I got instead was the knowledge that the debt was cleared, and that my parents had built a celebration around a story where I didn't exist. The realization hit hard, something was terribly off. I dug out the trust documents my uncle prepared. For the first time I read them carefully. My name wasn't a footnote, it was central. The house wasn't something my father could hand off like a wrapped present, it was legally tied to the years of money I had poured into it. So I went to my uncle. Sitting across from him, I learned he had always assumed I understood the authority those papers gave me. I walked away with a clarity I'd never had before. The house wasn't my father's gift to give. It was my sacrifice claimed by someone else's narrative. Graduation weekend didn't feel like a milestone, it felt like an exam I never agreed to take. Friday evening I turned down my parents' street. Cars lined the curb, string lights wrapped the porch, and a banner with my brother's name hung loud across the door. From the outside, it looked like a perfect story about a family triumphing together. Inside, the noise hit like a wave. Relatives packed every room. People brushed past me with quick hugs, then drifted toward Dylan as if drawn by gravity. Every conversation orbited him. His future job, his future home, his plans for the yard once he moved in. The house I had quietly poured my youth into was already being treated as his stepping stone. My father walked around retelling a version of events polished to shine, how he fought for the house, how he stayed strong through rough years. My mother stayed beside him, passing drinks, nodding, supporting his script. Not once did they mention me. Across the room, my Uncle Edward watched, knowing every line of the real story and seeing exactly what was being erased. Then my father called everyone into the living room. People squeezed together while he stood near the fireplace and spoke about the house as the heart of our family, about perseverance, about a future built for his son. And then he said the words I'd been waiting to hear aloud. The home would be my brother's graduation gift. Hearing that declaration in front of the assembled relatives transformed the private insult of the phone call into something heavier. It wasn't just between me and my father anymore. It was a public statement for everyone to absorb, that my role in this family, in this house, didn't matter. Edward stepped in before the narrative could fully settle. Calmly, methodically, he reminded my father that the house wasn't just a sentimental item he could hand over like a trophy. He referenced the trust, the agreements that existed precisely because someone else, me, had been paying that mortgage. He didn't even have to mention my name. The implication was enough for a few heads to turn. The applause my father had expected never arrived. Guests began slipping out earlier than they might have, the energy subtly shifting. I drove back to my apartment that night with a kind of clarity I hadn't experienced before. As long as I allowed my story to remain in the hands of others, my efforts would remain invisible. If a line was ever going to be drawn, it would have to be drawn by me. A few days later I returned to the house alone. The banner and lights were gone, the street restored to its usual quiet. I slid my key into the lock and it stopped halfway. The mechanism had been changed. That subtle resistance spoke volumes. The house, the space I had funded and fought for, was now formally closed to me. Dylan appeared, boxes stacked behind him, a silent message clear in the way he lingered in the doorway. Whatever this place represented now, it did not include me. The door clicked shut, and I realized my next move would not be another compromise. It would be the start of boundaries my family had never anticipated. The quiet that followed stayed with me. It wasn't confusion anymore, it was recognition of what had been decided. The key lay useless on my coffee table, a small, cold reminder of years I had invested in a home I could no longer enter. Sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the porch, the new lock, my brother standing in the doorway as if the space had always been his. The The comforting story I'd told myself about selfless sacrifice now felt hollow. The next morning I pulled out the storage box from under my bed, laid it across the kitchen table, and emptied its contents: statements, emails, mortgage notices, proof of every payment I had made. Each document marked a choice I had made to prioritize my parents' stability over my own comfort. Among them were the trust documents Edward had insisted upon. Reading them, my name wasn't just attached to obligations but to the future authority over the property. For the first time, I treated this situation like work rather than family drama. I listed what I could not control: my parents' fairness, my brother's gratitude, and what I could: my money, my decisions, and my legal position regarding the house. That led me to Attorney Patrick O'Neill. I laid out the sequence of events, complete and unembellished. He focused on the papers, not the emotions, and pointed to clauses that allowed me to prevent transfers, block ownership changes, and ensure any formal decision about the house involved me. Hearing it framed so neutrally stripped away any lingering doubt. I wasn't an overreacting child. I was the person who had cleared a massive debt and was now legally entitled to safeguards. I consulted my cousin, Nena Lane, who had a background in financial records and property management. She confirmed that my father had already begun shifting the house toward Dylan and that the trust had created questions because of my involvement. This wasn't accidental confusion, it was a calculated assumption that I would stay quiet. Later, I stopped by our old neighbor Martha Reed's house. She had watched our family for decades and noticed subtle shifts. She understood that official envelopes or unfamiliar cars could signal change, and that details like this mattered. That night, I reorganized the papers, placing them neatly in folders on the shelf where I could reach them. They no longer felt like old records, they felt like tools. I was done waiting for my parents to decide to be fair. What happened next would depend on how far I was willing to go to protect the part of the story that belonged to me. By the time our extended family gathered for the usual summer cookout near Lake Ontario, the house had stopped being a backdrop and became a boundary I was ready to enforce. Folding chairs circled the grills, kids darted between coolers, and conversations unfolded with Dylan at the center. On the surface, it appeared normal, but underneath, almost every discussion bent toward him: the house, the future, the plans. I listened as my father repeated the narrative he preferred: the perseverance, the sacrifice, the satisfaction of seeing Dylan inherit a secure future. My mother reinforced it quietly with small comments: drinks refilled, plates topped off. The narrative left no room for me. I didn't arrive empty-handed. The thin folder containing mortgage statements and trust documents rested in my bag. I didn't plan to wave it around, but I wasn't about to let my father's version harden into reality without challenge. When a conversation about the house inevitably arose at a picnic table, I opened the folder and laid it out. Eyes moved from the papers to my father and back to me. The notion that the house was a simple gift began to unravel. Questions arose, and the smooth story my parents had rehearsed faltered. My father tried to brush it off as legal minutiae. My mother tried to redirect the conversation to lighter topics. The warmth they hoped for never returned fully. Yet small shifts were noticeable. Cousins approached later with quiet words, and messages appeared on my phone. The family that had accepted my father's version by default now realized there was more beneath the surface. A day later, my brother posted a video in front of the house, framing it as the beginning of his life there and a symbol of parental pride. Comments poured in with congratulations. From my apartment, I watched my role in that story vanish with each like and reaction. For the first time, I understood clearly. The narrative I had lived in silently was mine to reclaim or to let be rewritten. And I had decided no one would continue to edit me out of my own life. Watching that video from my apartment, I felt a strange mix of anger and resolve. Every click, every comment, every cheer for my brother was a silent reminder of all the months and years I had sacrificed. I wasn't angry at him, he didn't orchestrate this, but the world seemed willing to give him credit for what I had done. That had to change. The next morning I returned to the house with the folder, more determined than ever. I went through every page meticulously, every statement, every transfer, every note confirming my payments. I traced back each one, matching it with the dates and agreements. Each figure, each signature reinforced the fact that my work had built the foundation this house stood on. It wasn't sentimental. It wasn't emotional. It was fact. Concrete, undeniable fact. I realized something important. While my family had the narrative, I had the evidence. I had the power to make sure that narrative could never completely erase my contributions. The trust documents were key. they weren't just protection, they were legal recognition of my role in keeping the house afloat. For the first time, I approached the situation not as a daughter hopping to be seen, but as someone with clear, enforceable rights. I called my attorney again, making an appointment to review the documents. Patrick O'Neill was methodical, precise. He went through the clauses, explaining how I could use them to prevent any unauthorized transfers. The house, he reminded me, was never just a family heirloom. It was tied to my financial and legal efforts. This wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition, about protecting what I had built with my own work. I also reached out to my cousin, Nena Lane. Her expertise with financial records and property dealings confirmed what I already suspected. My father was attempting to rewrite history, to present Dylan as the one responsible for keeping the house secure. Every document in my folder proved otherwise. Together, we mapped out exactly how to safeguard my position, ensuring that no future move could exclude me without legal consequences. The following week, I returned to the house during a quieter moment. The yard was empty, the banner long gone. I unlocked the door and entered, key fitting perfectly this time, feeling the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to walk through the rooms without feeling invisible. I saw not just the space, but the work I had poured into it. Every payment, every sacrifice, every decision I had made to protect the home flashed vividly in my mind. I knew confrontation wasn't my goal, not yet. My goal was clarity, recognition, and a firm boundary. I sorted through the papers, putting them in order, labeling them clearly. These weren't just reminders, they were tools. Tools I could use if my family tried to push me aside again. Tools that guaranteed that the narrative of this house included me, accurately and fully. By summer, when our extended family gathered by Lake Ontario for the usual cookout, everything felt different. I walked onto the grass with the folder tucked under my arm, not as a passive observer but as someone whose role could no longer be ignored. Conversations drifted to Dylan as expected, but this time I was ready. I placed the folder on the picnic table openly, letting the documents speak for themselves. Relatives paused, eyes scanning the pages. The air shifted subtly. Questions arose. The narrative my parents had rehearsed for months faltered. My father tried to dismiss it as technicalities. My mother attempted to redirect the conversation, but the moment had shifted. What had been silent, invisible work was now visible, undeniable. People who had accepted my father's version now had to reconcile with the truth. I didn't need to argue or yell. I simply presented the facts, and that was enough. In the following days, I noticed small changes. Cousins and family members reached out quietly, acknowledging the hidden effort I had given. My brother remained largely unaware of the full scale, but I no longer felt erased. My work, my sacrifices, my role in keeping the family home intact were now recognized. The power dynamic had shifted subtly, yet permanently. Finally, I understood something profound. For years, I had equated love and validation with compliance. But now I saw that self-respect didn't require my family's approval. Protecting the part of my life I had invested in, standing firm and refusing to be rewritten, that was my victory. The house, once a symbol of unseen labor, had become a monument to perseverance, a reminder that hard work and clarity could reclaim spaces even when others tried to deny them. And in that moment I realized something else. Boundaries aren't built overnight. They are laid carefully with awareness and precision. Every payment I made, every sacrifice I endured, every document I secured was part of that boundary. It was no longer just about a house. It was about claiming my story, my contributions, and refusing to let anyone else edit them out. I left the house that day feeling different, lighter but also stronger. The key in my hand no longer felt like a token of denial but of empowerment. The home I had kept alive with my own efforts was now legally, visibly, undeniably tied to me. And for the first time in years, I felt like the protagonist in my own life, rather than a silent witness to someone else's story.